New York City Democratic Congressman Ritchie Torres. Ritchie, it's good to see you. You're in some ways, I think a lot of the folks that listen to me and are watching me do know who you are. You're a progressive Democrat who's really pro-Israel, been one of the more important voices for those that support Israel in the New York City area. But I miss the old Stephen Colbert days of get to know your district. So I made Goldman do this. So I'm going to make you do this because tell me about your district. Like I've never been to New York City. Describe this district to somebody that lives in Rolla, Missouri.
So I represent one of the few congressional districts that's wholly contained within one county. I represent about half the Bronx. So my district is home to the New York Yankees. And it's really known for its institutions. We have the New York Botanical Garden. We have the Bronx Zoo. At Fordham University, the largest employer in the Bronx is the Montefiore Health System.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just an ethnically and racially varied district, Dominican and Latino and Puerto Rican and Mexican population in the South Bronx,
Mm-hmm.
an African-American and Caribbean population in the Northeast Bronx, a Jewish population in Riverdale, Irish
Mm-hmm.
population in Woodlawn. So I have Little Italy, Little Ireland, Little Yemen. It is remarkable for its diversity, and I have a special reverence for Arthur Abbey, Little Italy. There may be no community in New York City that has a greater concentration of businesses that have been owned by the same family for more than 100 years.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So it's one of the most, I would argue it's the best congressional district in America, but of course I have a bias.
You better say that. So you butt up against AOC in her district? Is she at the other part of the Bronx?
Yes.
Yeah. And what's the difference between hers and yours? Is it beyond geography, beyond just butting up against? I mean, what her district is?
Yeah.
It's not all contained in the Bronx, right?
Yeah. So I'm exclusively in the Bronx,
Right.
whereas AOC represents both the Bronx and Queens. I split the South Bronx with AOC. I split the West Bronx with Adriano Espaillat, and I split the Northeast Bronx with George Latimer. And AOC primarily represents the East Bronx, which happens. My mother happens to live in her district.
Oh, well, there you go. And she can't vote for you. Mom can't vote for you.
She cannot vote for me now.
No.
She votes for me in spirit, but not in practice.
You served on the New York City Council, and I don't think people are fully appreciate how enormous the New York City Council is. I mean, every time you're like, wait, 100 and how many members?
Yeah, so I might have had more staff as a New York City Council member than I did as a member of Congress. Unlike most local legislators who operate with volunteer staff, with part-time staffers, New York City has a full-time professional legislature. It's about 51 members, one of whom is the speaker, and each member of the city council represents about 160 to 170,000 people, and have enormous power over land use development within their districts. I was in charge of investigations. I had not only my own personal staff, but the investigations and oversight division of the city council reported to my committee. So it was great preparation for my role in Congress, because I feel like as a former city council member, I have an on-the-ground knowledge of how federal policies and programs operate at the local level, because so much of what we did locally was essentially the administration of federal programs and priorities.
So look, I'm obsessed with uncapping the House. I think we need to double the size of Congress. And you have a unique window here. You went from a constituency of about 100 to 150,000, you just said, right? To a constituency of approximately 800,000. Talk to me about those challenges. And is 800,000 too much? Should it be 400,000?
I would maintain the status quo, to be honest with you. The House has trouble functioning with 435 members, not to mention the representatives of territories. The thought of doubling the size of the House, I mean, there is a point at which just operationally becomes overwhelming. So I would maintain the status quo. The greatest concern I have about the House is just running every 2 years. At the moment you've won your election, you're beginning a new election cycle, and And I feel like there are members of Congress who just spend too much time fundraising, too much time campaigning. It has a crowding out effect on governing. We have 2-year terms. The president has
Mhm.
4-year terms. Senators have 6-year terms. The Supreme Court has a lifetime appointment. So the House got the short end of the stick.
Well, did it, or is it supposed to be the most small d Democratic? Right,
Yeah.
like this is where I do think it. I think in this case more is better. If the founders were here, they would say that.
It's a fair point. If I have to choose between a world in which both the Senate and the House have 4-year terms
Hmm.
or the status quo, I probably would prefer both to have 4-year terms.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What was the term length on the city council?
4 years.
4 years,
Yeah.
and same 4 years, or did they stagger it?
Your term limited, so you're confined to 2 terms.
Got
And
it.
when I entered the New York City Council, I was in favor of term limits
Hmm.
because I felt it creates space for a new generation of leadership.
Yeah.
But since then, I've become a skeptic because the mass exodus of members from the city council
Yeah.
has led to a real brain drain, and it has the effect of shifting power from elected officials to the unelected staff, the
I
permanent,
I
the so-called deep state of the city council. So
I believe this every single state legislative capital,
yeah,
okay, that has done this. The lobbyists run the
yes,
legislature.
yeah,
Because they have the institutional memory. So,
question.
by the way, some very well-meaning lobbyists, they're not, but just because you're a lobbyist doesn't mean you're only out for the, standing up for bad guys. It just doesn't, but they're not term limited, right?
And and it's even more so at the federal level. The issues that I tackle as a member of Congress are so immensely
Hmm.
complicated that you cannot learn them overnight. You can only learn them over time by
Right.
osmosis. And so there is something to be said for institutional memory. I feel it creates a much more democratic government.
So I went on a bit of a rant the other day about the lack of bipartisanship these days in this respect. Here you had Donald Trump, who is in favor of a couple things that there are a majority of Democrats that are in favor of. Raising he wants a tax rate for millionaires as one way. He floated it out there. We know that there's Democratic support for that. Yet he didn't go and seek it. He did an executive order on prescription drugs that has no teeth whatsoever. If he had worked on finding Democrats to help him, you could suddenly probably get some bipartisan legislation. He's not alone. The last Democratic president didn't make much. I don't feel like Biden made much of an effort to reach out Republicans, and we could say Republicans didn't want to be outreached to. Barack Obama had to do Obamacare solo. George W. Bush basically passed his prescription drug benefits solo. What does it take? And if Donald Trump came to House Democratic caucus and said, "Hey, I want to raise tax. I want to create a tax rate, a higher tax rate for those that make 2 million or more." Um, are we in a space where there could be a bipartisan agreement on that, or is the toxicity of Trump himself now make it impossible for bipartisanship in this current Congress?
I feel the the appearance of DC is much more partisan than the reality, particularly. So I want to take issue with something you said with Biden. I
Mhm.
actually felt, for all the partisanship, particularly in the wake of January 6th, that he had a bipartisan and productively bipartisan presidency. Veteran health care, gun safety, the CHIPS Act, infrastructure, all of which were passed on a bipartisan basis, and those are significant pieces of legislation.
Not
And
all of them were. A lot of them were in the party line vote, but some of
well,
it was in the
the
bipartisan.
Inflation Reduction Act was party line, but CHIPS
Right.
Act was bipartisan.
Yeah.
Gun safety was bipartisan. Veteran health care was bipartisan. Infrastructure was bipartisan, and those are 4 significant pieces of legislation. And Trump 1.0 was somewhat bipartisan, right? You had the trade bill, you
Hmm.
had criminal justice reform, which was actually directly negotiated with Leader Jeffries.
Right.
Trump 2.0 is quite different. I mean, he's just much more vindictive and aggressive and emboldened than ever before. And he is poisoning the well and has made it increasingly impossible for Democrats to have anything resembling a working relationship with him. So I felt like there were prospects for bipartisanship with
Right.
Trump 1.0, but he's a radically different person.
Look, you have a reputation for being incredibly reasonable. Have you heard from his congressional liaisons?
I've had no
Yeah.
communication with Trump. I mean, I have relationships with congressional Republicans. Like, I'm
Sure.
known
No,
to
I'm
be a
talking about
bipartisan.
the Trump White House, because I remember stories about the early Reagan days
Yeah.
where they specific now, granted, they had a Democratic House they were dealing with. So there was they had to have relationships if they were going to pass legislation, but it was a day one priority. And you're right, Trump 1.0 did want to. There would be days where it felt like, yeah, he brought in Democratic lawmakers to have a conversation about this or that. Um, there seems to be no demand, no interest in that whatsoever. Even as this prescription drug executive order, you get 300 votes in the House for it.
It just seems to me he has contempt for Congress. He expects the Republicans to fall in line, and they largely do. And he's in vindictive mode. I mean, he's just intent on dismantling the bureaucracy of the government and higher
Mhm.
education. Like, everyone, including Democrats, seem to be on his Nixonian enemies list. So I see no appetite for bipartisanship in either direction.
Um, what is that gonna? I mean, that's a pretty ugly next 2.5 years we're going to spend, is it not?
It bodes poorly for the country. And look, I think a few weeks ago I wrote something to the effect: if a superpower were planting the seeds of its own decline,
Yeah.
right, it would paralyze the global economy with the certainty of uncertainty. It would erode confidence in the reserve status of the dollar. It would
Mhm.
discard due process. It would defund scientific and medical research. It would sabotage advanced chip making, and it would grow the deficit until debt service becomes the largest expense in the federal budget.
Mhm.
And that is America in 2025 under Donald Trump. I feel like we're in a dangerous place.
So what do you do as a lawmaker? You're a Democrat, you're a lawmaker. In theory, you're in the arena. What role can you play to get us out of this?
Well, first we have to. I mean, I have to resist. So take Medicaid. There's no congressional district in America that has a greater stake in Medicaid than mine. 67% of my congressional district is enrolled in Medicaid. In my district, more than 70% of children, more than 80% of
Yeah.
nursing home residents, more than 90% of baby deliveries are covered by Medicaid.
Mhm.
And so I have to spend much of my political capital fighting this unprecedented assault on the social safety net upon which the Bronx is heavily, heavily dependent. The largest employer in the Bronx
Yeah.
is the Montefiore Health System, which employs
Right.
tens of thousands of people and depends heavily on Medicaid. And Medicaid matters not only to districts like mine, but to blue states and red states, urban communities and
Well,
rural
you saw
communities.
Josh Hawley, Republican senator from Missouri. He's well aware of majority of his constituents love Medicaid or rely on it.
Medicaid is not only health insurance for the lowest income, it has become long-term care for the elderly and the disabled and the
Richie,
chronically ill. Yeah.
both my grandmother and my wife's grandmother, the end of life care that they needed, we couldn't have afforded without the help of Medicaid. Both
So,
instances.
I feel Medicaid is every bit as vital to senior citizens as Medicare. Like, in New York State, the elderly and the disabled account for 20% of the enrollees, but make up 60% of the expenses.
Mhm.
And so an attack on Medicaid is ultimately an attack on the elderly and the disabled.
Right.
And that's the case we're making.
Do you take any so the way they're writing this bill, um, and guys like Chip Roy are unhappy with it. It feels as if all of the potential cuts to Medicaid or reforms, whichever side of the aisle you want to be on this, don't kick in for a few years, which means it feels as if they're going to get their hamburger today, they'll pay for it down the road, and by the time down the road comes, there'll probably be a different Congress that makes sure those either work requirements don't kick in or those cuts don't kick in. Do you think do you take any sort of solace in the fact that that's probably what this legislation may end up looking like?
It's not clear, and the only issue is not the legislation. So,
Mhm.
under Donald Trump, 13.7 million people are in danger of losing their health care. So the Republican reconciliation bill could cause 8.6 million to lose their health care. But then you have the expiration of the Affordable Care Act's premium tax credits, which might cause 4.2 million people to lose their health care. And then there's a Trump regulation that could cause 1.8 million. So those numbers are staggering. That's comparable to the number of people who would have lost their health care during the initial attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So I do feel the impact will be felt. Republicans are going to message that their targets are not the elderly and the vulnerable.
Right.
It's undocumented immigrants or it's work requirements. But, it's deceptive. You're reducing money for the overall system, which will not only kill people's lives, but also livelihoods.
Right.
And the work requirements are essentially paperwork requirements. There's no evidence that work requirements lead to actual work. It simply causes people to lose their health insurance. So Arkansas was the first state to
Right.
implement a work requirements program. It did not boost employment. It simply led 18,000 people to lose their health insurance in the first 5 months of the program. And the majority of those people were eligible for Medicaid.
Yeah. What is there can you split Medicaid eligibility between, say, children who are citizens versus maybe one parent who may not be?
I mean, I don't know how you could.
That's what
like
I'm
if
trying to
you're,
figure out. I don't know
if-
how you I get the thesis, but I don't know how you do it, and that's what I was curious.
look, if you are, if you a $715 billion defunding of Medicaid is going to reduce funding for every safety net hospital, for every hospital in America, which means less care for everyone, not simply for the population you're targeting. You're reducing funding for the overall system. And I also feel like we should be a compassionate society. If you're an undocumented immigrant and you have a heart attack, are the Republicans suggesting that you should not get emergency care and that care should not be covered by the federal government? Is that the kind of society that we want to live in, that we want people to be left to die because of their immigration status or because of their income? Like the consequences of what they're proposing are barbaric.
So when you is there any so you don't even see a feasible way of, even if you were trying to do this and say, well, children who are citizens are eligible for Medicaid, but their parents are not.
I do not buy that you can surgically target undocumented immigrants without destabilizing the overall system. I mean,
Mhm.
even today, we are underinvesting in long-term care. Right? There are 800,000 people on the waiting list for Medicaid-funded long-term care. And we're an aging society, so more and more people are going to be living longer and longer. Their healthcare needs will become more complex. The need for long-term care will rise over time. And most of the hospitals in places like New York are either teetering on the brink or underwater.
Rich, yeah, let me tell you on this long-term care, even if you think you can afford your own long-term care policy, you can't get one to sell you. My wife and I got our long-term care policies when we were in our early 30s. We're now in our 50s. Do you know how many times this insurance company has tried to buy us out? They're desperately trying to get us off their books. They don't want it. Now we got it because she lost her parents early in life, and it was more of a, hey, this is something that we were concerned about. But there's not even a marketplace for long-term care that's realistic. And I feel like government has been dropping the ball on this one for a long period of time. Now, I don't know what long-term care uh, government-funded insurance looks like here. Do you have a thought? Do you have a blueprint in your head about how you would help to? Because this is increasingly people are my age, right? We've got kids in college and we've got aging parents, right? We're caught in this. Um, is there a realistic policy here that can help out? Is it all just through Medicaid or is there something else?
I mean, Medicaid is what we have. It's inherently expensive. I mean, nursing homes are expensive. Assisted living is expensive. You know, I think we should be advocating for home care, allowing people to age at home and age in place.
Mhm.
But there's no escaping the problem in America is not that we're investing too much in long-term care. The problem is that we're investing too little.
Look, I've got a grandmother. They staff. She's all there. She's physically just has to be in an assisted living facility, and she tells me all the time. She's like, "Yeah, they're always understaffed, especially on weekends. They never have enough staff, and this is universal. And so we have a healthcare worker shortage in this country as well."
Innovations like telehealth can make a
Hmm.
difference. So, I have a constituent who is caring for her father who has Alzheimer's,
Hmm.
and she would have to wake up 5 hours before his appointment in order to pick him up from his bed and bathe him and feed him and clothe him and then bring him down the stairs. Like the process of bringing him to the hospital was arduous. And then telehealth was a game changer. Right? It allowed him to receive
Hmm.
medical care from the comfort of his own home. So there are innovations that can dramatically lower the cost of healthcare
Hmm.
and make it more personalized.
Let me switch to national security. This is also in the Middle East and the president's trip. We're speaking here. I want to timestamp this Thursday, May 15th. President's just wrapping up his trip to the Middle East. I want to get your reaction to something he said in a speech he gave at Saudi Arabia. Sort of his version of realpolitik. He said, "Far too many American presidents have been afflicted with the notion that it is our job to look into the souls of foreign leaders and use U.S. policy to dispense justice for their sins. It is God's job to sit in judgment, my job to defend America and to promote the fundamental interests of stability, prosperity, and peace." It's sort of a realpolitik. Hey, we're not going to tell Saudi Arabia how to run their society. We're not going to tell Qatar. We're not going to tell I assume this also means we're not going to tell Germany how they should manage their politics, but I'll get to that. It is sort of selective here, I think, a little
Yes.
bit. But in theory, what he's saying, where are you on that issue? What should America conduct its foreign policy always through this prism of realism? How much aspirational pro-democracy morality should we also be preaching?
So I'm not a Jacksonian like Donald Trump, uh, but nor am I a Wilsonian. I am skeptical about the use of American power to spread democracy throughout the world. I thought both the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan and the decision to invade Iraq was a grave miscalculation. It was a grave,
Mhm.
um, colossal waste of American resources and lives. Um, I saw one study indicating that the cost of every post 9/11 war is $8 trillion when you factor in the cost of disability benefits and veteran health care. And that's $8 trillion not spent on meeting the domestic needs of the American people. So there is a sense in which his critique of
Never mind lost
neoconservatism,
prestige, lost soft power, things like that you can't really put a price on.
there's a sense in which his critique of neoconservatism resonates widely,
Mhm.
including with me and my generation, which came of age during the Iraq War and during the
Right,
Afghanistan War,
right.
is suspicious of the establishment and is suspicious of the overzealous use of American power. But I'm more of a Hamiltonian. I do feel like we have to build relationships with countries based on shared economic interests, but also values do matter. But someone once made an observation. Someone said to me, China goes to the global south and gives us infrastructure, and America goes to the global south and gives us a lecture. And
100%.
there's something to that. Like,
Yeah.
I think we people want to have a relationship with the United States. They want us as a security partner. They want us as a trading partner, and we should have a Hamiltonian focus on winning their goodwill rather
Mhm.
than lecturing people about their government.
All right. Well, we established that. So let's talk about Qatar
Yeah.
because I've been um, a Qatar skeptic for some time. The amount of money they throw at Washington, um, I've I'd like to think I've worked really hard to make sure it didn't infuse in anything I was working on, but whether it's purchasing a minority stake in some sports franchises in DC, to it's hard to go to an event in Washington that isn't somehow partially funded by Qatar. And now this airplane business. How do you view them and what they're doing? Because they might say, "Hey, we're doing what Saudi Arabia did in the 70s and 80s, and it worked for them. Why shouldn't we use the same playbook?"
I feel like there are two models in the Middle East, right? There's the Emirati and now Saudi model of pursuing modernization and moderation.
Mhm.
Uh, we want to put a premium on prosperity. We want to actually, frankly, be more like the West. And then there's the Iranian and Qatari model of sponsoring terrorism and destabilizing the region. But unlike Iran, the United States does not treat Qatar like the pariah it should. I feel like Qatar has been a destructive force in the world. It is a state sponsor of Hamas, which committed the deadliest day, October 7th, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. So I feel like there should be a reexamination of our relationship with Qatar, and the ties that the Trump administration has to Qatar are cause for alarm.
I mean, I look, not to be super cynical here, but I'm going to be for a second. So if Joe Biden accepted an airplane from Qatar, what do you think the Republican response would be among your congressional colleagues?
If Joe Biden were promoting his personal meme coin or selling access to the White House to the 220 highest bidders, or receiving $2 billion in foreign deposits in exchange for his personal stable coin, or accepting a $400 million palace in the sky, the Republicans would be pursuing his impeachment.
By the way, would that be outrageous that they were in your mind?
There would be grounds for doing so.
Yeah, it is. This is.
Or
I
even
think.
if Joe Biden were imposing a
Yeah.
global tariff regime.
Yes.
I mean, the
Without
irony
going to
is,
Congress, without
but
usurping powers of Congress. Yeah.
the organizing principle of our politics is no longer policy, it's personality. Like Donald Trump has completely reversed the ideological dynamics of the two parties. He has made Republicans the party of protectionism and price controls. I've heard Democrats quoting Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman
I know.
while critiquing Donald Trump's tariff policy. It's the world has been inverted.
But now there's small ways that he's taken advantage of this that might be a net positive. He's going to cut a deal with Iran that Joe Biden, he's literally the same deal that Barack Obama cut. It's like USMCA versus NAFTA, right? He's just going to change the name. I cut the deal, so it's different. Syria, I'm not sure a Democratic president would have any Republican support for doing what he did with Syria this week. Am I being overly cynical here?
I think if Biden had done it, there would have been, look, if Biden had given the speech that Trump gave in Saudi Arabia, there would have been the same outrage against Biden that we saw against Obama when he delivered his speech in the Middle East.
Which also was very similar. That Cairo speech in some ways thematically saying, hey, look, this is a different culture. These are different, we've got to be careful when we impose. And yeah, it was deemed by some unpatriotic, un-American.
Or going on an apology tour.
Right? The apology tour, per se.
Yes.
Although it sounds like that this would be that. He's basically apologizing to our allies in the Middle East. What should that teach us about where we're headed with our politics? And because I sit here, look, 85% of what he's doing, I think, is very damaging. But then there's that 15%. Well, look, I think this is healthy that we're trying to move to a different place with Iran. It's healthy that we're trying to you reward Syria. Look, we had a policy of getting rid of Assad. This guy got rid of him. Let's give him a chance, right? So what does that tell you about maybe how Democrats ought to use power when they're in charge?
For all our imperfections, the Democratic Party, it continues to be a normal political party. Like we're an ideologically varied coalition, ranging from the Squad to the Blue Dogs. The Republican Party is no longer a normal political party. It's become a cult of personality around Donald Trump. I mean, he is a singular phenomenon in American history. I'm aware of no political figure who has had as much control over a political party as Donald Trump has had over the Republican Party. I mean, it's a religion.
Close. FDR came close, but that was also, he had the time, the era on his side, if you will.
Fair enough.
There was a crisis, but even then, there were certain Democrats he didn't have control over.
It just feels like Republican politics has become a religion, and the devotion to Donald Trump has a religious quality to it.
Yeah, no, it does. So let's talk about the Democrats. What should be the first of all? Do you think Ro Khanna said that it's time for Democrats to admit we were wrong about Biden? We should have said something sooner. Where are you on the Biden question?
No question. I mean, I think there's no point in denying that we made a great mistake in thinking that Biden was remotely capable of running again. So that was a mistake that we made as a party, and we should own up to it. I feel like we should level with people.
Right. I take your point there. Is there someone to blame outside of Joe Biden, or is this a Joe Biden issue?
I mean, I think it's principally Joe Biden and his team. And keep in mind, one thing I noticed about Donald Trump is that he's extremely accessible to even the most rank and file Republicans in the House. Joe Biden was the exact opposite. He rarely met with members of Congress, particularly in the House. Maybe his first year he had meetings, but he was insulated by his staff.
Did you have
And
a meeting with him? How many times did you have
I
face to
met with
faces
him
with him?
once or twice. I was part of a small group of people who met with him
Mhm.
early on in his first year, but then he became less and less accessible over time.
No, wasn't just members of Congress. Apparently, it was the cabinet as well. Um, as far as credibility, I mean, do you think your leadership, because both Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer have just steered clear of this. Now, I've been critical. I think they should have sounded the alarm sooner, um, as leaders of the party at the time, but they've not wanted to confront this question at the moment. And I get it. On one hand, it's like, hey, let's not. That's the past. We need to deal with what we have now. But what posture do you think they should be taking?
I feel like the party collectively should admit that we made a mistake. And we're paying a price in the form of a second Donald Trump presidency, which is far worse than even his first. And keep in mind, and look, I ultimately felt we lost because of inflation and to a lesser extent immigration, the migrant crisis.
Mhm.
But keep in mind the shift of 250,000 votes in the industrial Midwest
Right.
could have handed the election to Kamala Harris. So maybe if we had an open primary, maybe if we had a stronger candidate, maybe if Joe Biden had stepped down earlier, the results of the 2024 election could have been different. And for those reasons, we should acknowledge that we made a terrible mistake and not pressuring Biden to seek a second term.
When you see these polls where Democrats are sour on the Democratic Party, right? Where they have an unfavorable view of the party at the moment, and there's this brand issue. Do you think the party has an ideological issue? Is this a generational issue? What do you see as the problems that should be addressed right now?
Look, I do feel we're well positioned to win in 2026, but it has more to do with Donald Trump's weakness than it does with our strength. I mean, he's self destructing in real time. But I feel like we should, if there are, I do sense, to be blunt, among rank and file Democrats, widespread dissatisfaction. And we should take that to heart and we should do our best to improve. And I sense when I'm meeting with constituents, there's a real hunger for more information. People want to know, like, what is happening? What are we as Democrats doing to resist Donald Trump? And there's a hunger for a call to action. People want to be part of something. People want to
Mhm.
belong to something greater than themselves. And I feel like as a party, it's not enough for us to stand against Donald Trump. We have to stand
Right.
for something. We have to put forward a vision that will inspire not only our base, but the country. Newt Gingrich had the contract with America in the
Right.
1990s. Maybe we should have our own contract with America. Donald Trump has Project 2025. We ought to have Project 2029. So I think my constructive self-criticism of my
Mhm.
party is that we should do more to put forward an affirmative vision for moving the country forward.
Bill Clinton likes to say, "Wrong and strong will always defeat weak and right." And the point being that there's a strength, sometimes projecting strength can overcome people not liking some of your ideas. And it does the thing that struck me about one survey I saw recently, to give a word or phrase, and among Democrats, they kept saying weak. So what this tells me, some people are going to interpret it and say, oh, the Democrats need to move left or the Democrats need to move right. I'm not sure it's a left-right issue. I think it is a strength issue, but that's sometimes that's eye of the beholder stuff.
Well, I do feel like if you swing the pendulum too far to the left, you will alienate most Americans, as we did on immigration.
Mhm.
And so I do feel like ideology does matter, but it's a necessary but insufficient condition. Like,
Mhm.
we need to have compelling messengers in the party, and we need to offer a compelling vision.
Are you a thousand flowers bloom right now? Get everybody into the arena and let's see who rises, or is there do you want to see a little more structure to this, fewer people trying to determine the future of the party?
What did Will Rogers say? I'm not a member of an organized political party. I'm a Democrat.
Is that how you
I don't
feel?
know. Let the cream rise.
Yeah.
Let there be a free marketplace of debate, and that's what we were lacking in 2024. Is there was a sense that the political establishment had put its thumb on the scale in
I,
favor of one
don't you
candidate.
feel like it's three nominees in a row, actually? When you look at the 16, 20, and 24, do you really think Democratic primary voters feel like they had a say?
In British politics, the race for prime minister plays out in a matter of weeks. Our presidential primary plays out over the course of a year or more.
Hmm.
But I feel like it's a character building experience. I mean, if you I remember Barack Obama was the first president I voted for, and
Hmm.
I felt like at the end of the process, he was a far better candidate
Oh,
than he was in the beginning.
I'm a big
Dramatically
defender of
improved.
the long campaign. I know
Yeah.
I'm a total polar opposite on this.
Yeah.
I think the long campaign, by the time you actually become president, it's almost feels easier
Yes.
than the slog. I mean, the decisions are weightier, don't get me wrong, right? Deciding how much TV should we put on in Wisconsin or what trips, but the grueling punishment, the David Axelrod calls it an MRI for the soul, running
Yeah.
for president, which I believe in. So it's that you think the long campaign
Yeah.
actually
I see it
helps.
as a character building experience, and it could have been the case that it would have resulted in Vice President Harris as the nominee, but she
Mhm.
would have been a better and stronger nominee because of the process. That the process matters as much as the substance, and in fact, it improves the substance.
It's the 10,000 hour effect, right? Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. You campaigned for 2 years. You've done your 10,000 hours of stupid interviews with people like me, glad handing, whatever it is, the round tables, and you learn. You just figure it out. No, it's an interesting point. Um, why aren't you running for New York City mayor?
It's
You know how many members? I can tell you this. I will just I'm gonna make you blush here. I got a lot of friends and family in New York City, and they're very disappointed you're not running.
um, how do I answer your question without diminishing the role of mayor? I have a few thoughts. First, it's probably and Michael Bloomberg has described it as the best job. I've heard him describe it as the best job he ever had. But
I'd argue it's one of the five most powerful elected positions in the globe.
I feel it is second. It is the second most demanding executive position in
Mhm.
America, second only to the presidency. And the
I
New
think
York
that's a
City
fair
press
point.
corps is notoriously aggressive and ruthless. Um, but I feel the prestige of the position exceeds the actual power. The mayor cannot
Well,
even
you were on
install
the council. You would know this better than most. So
the
explain
mayor
that.
cannot install speed cameras without the approval of the state legislature. That the most important questions on matters of housing and healthcare and public safety are often decided at the state level by the state legislature and by the governor. And so I just feel the state has a much greater systemic impact in advancing the issues that I care about. And then one more point, historically, the mayor's office has been a graveyard where political careers go to die. So if I were looking to retire
Yeah.
prematurely, then that would be the right place for me to go.
But I guess the reason why I think some of my well-connected friends, they see you as somebody that might be able to bring the city together, and they're just nervous about having a retread politician. They don't love the choice here. Make them feel better.
Uh, Look, I I'm going to vote for Andrew Cuomo,
Mhm.
and I'm going to share what I respect about the governor. And I'm sure you've been following. There's a new movement on the left known as the abundance movement.
Mhm.
And it's it's based on a recognition that America is no longer a nation of builders. We've become a nation
Right.
of bureaucrats. And to his credit, Andrew Cuomo was one of the few executives in the 21st century who was a genuinely great builder. LaGuardia Airport, Moynihan Train Hall, Mario Cuomo Bridge. Um, that's a rarity. It was once common in the early 20th century,
Mhm.
but he's one of the few executives with a proven ability to execute on grand infrastructure projects. And so that to me represents Governor Cuomo at his best, and that's
Yeah.
why I would vote for him because I see him as the most experienced of everyone in the field.
Does he need to do more on sort of acknowledging the character flaws?
I feel I I I think we all benefit from acknowledging our failings.
Mhm.
I think when you level with people and say I made mistakes and I have failings, uh, people appreciate it.
He seems a
Like
tad resistant to that tone. I've not heard that tone from him.
there is something to be said for humility and acknowledging your own fallibility.
Mhm.
That's just human. People want their elected officials to be vulnerable and authentic and humble
Yep.
and acknowledge
And
that.
like them, it's a representative democracy.
Yeah, and
Like
we're
them.
all a work in progress.
Right.
I've made decisions that I regret, but you live and you learn.
So, it sounds like to me you've made the case that if you wanna make life better in New York City, the best place for you to do that's in Albany. And you've been rumored about that. So let me ask you directly, is that something you've thought about for 26 or not yet?
I'm exploring a run for governor. I will make a final decision in the summer after the mayor's race. I'll conduct polling. But if you ask me, what would I prefer? Would I prefer
Yeah.
to be one of 435 or one of 535 in Congress, or an executive with a unilateral domain of action? I would prefer to be
Yeah.
an executive because you could have a far greater impact in improving people's
Let's
lives.
talk about housing. This is a passion of yours. You grew up in
Yeah.
public housing. You see, you know, housing is essential. We have a housing crisis in this country, and it's not just in New York, it's everywhere. It's the biggest argument in the county that I live in Arlington County. How are we going to get more housing? And it's, YIMBYs versus NIMBYs and all of that, right? Um, what do you think you could do as governor of New York to supercharge the availability and the affordability of housing for everyday New Yorkers?
Yeah, so at the core of the affordability crisis is a gap between supply and demand. Like the demand for affordable housing far exceeds the supply. There's a need for both deeper housing subsidy and greater housing supply. So we have to expand the supply of housing so that we can meet the demand. But we also have to ensure that the housing we do create is affordable to the lowest income families. One of the criticisms of affordable housing in New York is that much of the affordable housing we create is unaffordable to the poorest New Yorkers. And so I'm in favor of a concept known as housing vouchers for all. Like every family, either who's homeless or struggling with housing insecurity, should have access to a voucher, which ensures that you
Mhm.
pay no more than 30% of your income toward your rent. Universalizing access to vouchers would radically reduce the amount of homelessness and housing insecurity in American society. So that's one piece. But second, we have to expand housing supply. I do feel our in public review process or environmental review process is so cumbersome that it stifles affordable
Mhm.
housing creation in blue cities and blue states like New York. And those processes have to be reformed so that we can reestablish our country as a nation of builders.
So your campaign for governor, if it happens, housing I know is going to be in the top of that list. What else is on the top of your agenda that the voters going to think? No, if you do run, the focus of your campaign.
Lower costs, lower crime rates. That's simple.
And you feel as governor, how do you impact the crime rate as governor?
Well, public safety policy is ultimately set at the state level. And I would submit to you, New York has the most dysfunctional criminal justice system in the country. We
Mhm.
have a practice of releasing repeat violent offenders, which has led to a cycle of recidivism. So since 2019, there's been a 150% rise in the number of repeat offenders for felony assaults, more than 80% for robberies, more than 60% for burglaries and shoplifting, more than 100% for grand larceny auto, more than 70% for grand larceny. And I'll cite one example. There was a man by the name of Jamar Banks,
Mhm.
who stabbed 2 people on New Year's Day. And he had 54 priors, including an attempted shooting, a murder, multiple stabbings, multiple acts of domestic violence. And despite his extensive criminal history, he was released back onto the streets, where he proceeded to commit more violence against more innocent New Yorkers. And here's the problem. New York is the only state in the country that prohibits judges from considering the public safety risks of repeat violent offenders. You can only consider flight risks. And the question of whether judges should have the authority to consider public safety risk, if I were to present that question to the people of New York in the form of a referendum, it would be an 80-20 issue. 80% of New Yorkers would vote for it. Black,
Do you have
white,
to
Latino
change the
nation.
is this a legislative? You have
Legislation,
to.
yeah.
It's going to take legislation. Yeah.
Yes. But the trouble with City Hall, Albany, and Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
is that common sense has become dangerously uncommon. And one of the criticisms that I have of my own party is that there are times when we're more responsive to special interest groups than we are to everyday
100%.
people on the ground, particularly on issues of public safety.
100%. If Governor Hochul, is there anything she could do to convince you not to challenge her?
I mean, if she becomes an effective governor, then certainly that could persuade me to.
Is there an issue you could see if she took up, it would be persuasive or unlikely at this point?
The issue, it's not a failure of conception, it's a failure of execution.
Mm.
Like, there are issues in which I agree with the governor, but I just feel like she's fundamentally ineffective at governing the state. And I'll be blunt, I'm not aware of any New Yorker who's like a passionate Kathy Hochul supporter. Like when Andrew Cuomo was governor, he had a deep reservoir of support.
100%.
And
Yeah, the
at the peak
Cuomo
of his
name meant
popularity,
something to some people. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm aware of no one who's like a passionate champion of Kathy Hochul. She simply benefits from the power of incumbency. But look, the broken system is deeper than one governor, and it long predates the incumbent governor.
Mhm.
In 2015, New York had a $142 billion budget. 2024, a $254 billion budget.
Jesus.
I am not aware of a single New Yorker who has seen a $110 billion improvement in the delivery of state services.
So, your challenge to her, it's not easy to say, are you challenging her from the left or the right? You're not really, and it's not really an ideological challenge if you end up doing this. This is really more of a competency.
I
This is
feel
more of
I
a
transcend
competency
those.
play.
I feel
Yeah.
like I transcend those categories.
Well, no, it's why so many of my friends in New York wish you would be the next mayor, because of that. The idea that you're not easily pigeonholed and that you have a broader perspective.
Like some would think of my advocacy for public safety as challenging from the right. I would
Yep.
disagree with that characterization because I feel like
But
the average New Yorker.
but you know that's how it'll look as far as the polling is concerned, right?
But the
Where it breaks
concern
down.
about affordability, I mean, that could be argued that that's a challenge from the left. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm someone, for example, who believes that our public utilities, particularly our gas and electric utilities, should be owned by the pension funds,
Mm.
so that people pay a far lower rate. I mean, every year, my constituents have seen double-digit increases
That's
in
interesting.
their
So you
utility
think
bills.
the government pension fund should own the electric?
Yeah,
And that's an
that's
so that
because,
it
and I don't want
yeah.
to get too complicated, but
No, but I find this a fascinating idea. Go.
yeah. So the Public Service Commission regulates
Right.
utilities like Con Edison, and the trouble with the Public Service Commission, which is ultimately accountable to the governor,
Mhm.
is that it authorizes a rate of return that's far above the actual cost of capital, the actual cost that you would need to
Mhm.
operate the utility. And I'm convinced if those utilities were owned by pension funds, which would demand lower returns than shareholders, because
Mhm.
they're patient capital. Like if you tell them we guarantee you
long-term capital.
6% returns for the next 50 years, they're happy with 6%. They don't need 9%. They don't need 10%. So I am convinced that public ownership of these utilities through the pension funds would actually lower utility cost for everyday New Yorkers.
I tell you, I had not heard an idea like that. That makes it, especially when you think about the cost of pensions and all of this. To me, that's an interesting idea to sort of solve two problems, if you will.
But is that left wing or right wing? You could argue that's an attack from the left, but I just think that's common sense. It's good policy.
No, you could sit here. I could make a right wing argument against it or left wing argument against it, right? Which is the beauty of the idea. Sometimes you just have good ideas or bad ideas. It's okay to be a technocrat, and I say that with Michael
That is the
Bloomberg.
problem. My core criticism of the progressive movement, is that it's become more concerned with ideological purity than with the actual functioning of government. And what I appreciate about the abundance movement is that it sends the message: no, competence matters. The functioning of government matters.
This is what concerns. It's funny you say that's about the progressive. This is what concerns me about the reactionary nature of what the so-called successful rise of Trump, and that there are folks on the left that look at what MAGA was able to do, and they see that as a blueprint.
It's the wrong lesson.
Yeah.
I feel the American people have a pattern of punishing incompetence. When George W. Bush catastrophically mismanaged the response to Katrina, he never recovered.
Right.
When Joe Biden sloppily withdrew from Afghanistan, he never recovered.
I don't know if Trump's going to recover. Yeah, I don't think he's recovering from this.
But when he I would argue, but for the mismanagement of COVID, Trump would have been reelected to a second. But for the mismanagement of the migrant crisis, as well as inflation, a Democrat would be in the White House. So competence matters. And the people ask me, how should we restructure the Democratic Party? And for me, the key to restructuring the Democratic Party is restructuring democratic governance. Good governance is good politics. Delivering is good politics.
I've held you longer than I promised your staff that I would. So not a bad way to end. Competence, that is, I always say people like to understand my politics. And I'm always like, who's going to get stuff done? Excuse my language, right? Who's just going to get stuff done that's sort of in the rational middle, the folks that live between the 35-yard lines. So,
well, I'm on that team. So
it is good to see. Are you fired up about the Knicks? By the time this airs, we'll know whether they didn't blow it in Game 6 or not. I hope they don't. It's fun to. I hate rooting for New York teams. It's fun to root for this Knicks team.
No, it's long overdue, and I know my chief of staff is fanatical about the Knicks, so he's even more excited than I am.
Well, yeah, Jalen Brunson could maybe be the next mayor of New York City if things go right. Ritchie Torres, Congressman from the Bronx. Good to see you. Thank you.